Now, as we see feminist research, what we see that right now, it's in the present times, it has become a legitimate, relevant, and I can say a popular research model also because of the manner in which we use these conventional methodologies, the manner in which we, and also the way we focus on the areas is important. What is going to be a little different in your talk is that how feminist and anthropological, these two things are different. How is that as a field of study? How is that we bring these two approaches together? So for the participants, let me tell you, Professor J. Diana Fox, she's a cultural and applied anthropologist. She's also a social activist. Along with that, she has a wide range of areas in which she is working. Her research areas are sexual and gender diversity she has been working on. She has been working on social women movements, transnational feminism and activism, and many more. What was very interesting when I met her was I came to know that she is a film producer, also a documentary film producer, something, it's an emerging trend that's coming in, this research, we would like to say social science research or research per se. So I will not waste much time and I will directly request Professor Fox to kindly start her talk. Thank you. We welcome you once again, Professor Fox.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Given the many activities that I'm involved in for the moment, I want to apologize that I don't have slides to share with you, but I was able to put together some words in a talk. So I'm going to be sharing a talk as if I'm sharing a paper at a conference. Let me just jump into it. I'm speaking to you today quite purposely from my kitchen table, since it is from the domestic spheres of confinement that many women's movements have been formed around kitchen tables, spaces that were considered the least likely venues of political organizing, until feminists very explicitly developed the political strategy of the personal being political. So what I'm going to do is share with you some of the thoughts that I have regarding the insights of feminist and feminist anthropological research. And then depending on time, I'll be able to speak to you about some of my projects and very specifically how I engaged some of the methodological and theoretical frameworks that I'm going to share with you right now. So part one, introduction. I will focus my comments on both feminist research methodology and the transformation of research into feminist projects, whether they are writing, film, or collaborative activist engagements in social movements, all of which have been the results of my own work, some of which I will share, as I mentioned, and offer insights into the perspectives, processes, and outcomes of my work, positioning myself in relation to the examples of what I have achieved if I have some time. Doing so, positioning myself, reflects one of the most critical aspects of feminist thought, the value of, let me just pause and ask for those of you who have your mic on just to silence your mic so we don't get a lot of background noise.
Participants, kindly silence your mics. Professor Fox, you're not audible.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Okay, back to this. Positioning oneself in relationship to one's research is one of the most critical aspects of feminist thought. The value of lived experience and subjectivity as a pathway to knowledge, along with other ways of knowing, indigenous, for example, multiple cultural ways of knowing, spiritual ways of knowing, beyond masculinist, positivist approaches that have claimed what the feminist anthropologist Donna Haraway has called the God trick, claiming to speak for all from nowhere. Haraway has also noted that radical constructivism, however, that is completely positioning ourselves in a postmodern identity politics, is not enough. It's important, but it's not enough, and has posed the challenge for feminists as having simultaneously to generate an account of historical contingency that faces the partiality of our knowledge, as well as what she calls a no-nonsense commitment to accounts of the real world. That is, the systemic inequalities of power and materiality, of ideology that combine to create measurable outcomes, the impact on basic needs, on opportunities to flourish, on exclusions from the halls of power, or the use of those halls of power to exclude others, the violence that victimizes girls and women, and the violence that women inflict on other women or girls less powerful than they, the fact of gender and sexual diversity, and the ways in which these intertwining systems deny those diversities, seek to punish them, and to reinforce a binary world. These are the measurable realities, and the relationship between these two facets, the world of meaning, interpretation, and perspective that derives from our experiences in relationship to the world of measurable realities, constructed in part by the former, documenting, explaining, transforming. These are the central facets of feminism. So combining these two, the interpretive, the experiential, and the measurable in the systemic inequalities that shape our lives. We can not only resort to radical constructivism, we must also relate it to systemic inequalities. As a cultural anthropologist by training with a specialty in feminist action research, my life experiences, both personal and professional, have shaped my interests and my understanding, building upon one another. And this has been the case for all of us. When I was invited to talk to you, I read a bit, and excuse my pronunciation, I read a bit about Chandraprabha Sakyani, is that how you pronounce it? And her pioneering work in women's education in Assam. That your program is named after her roots your work in a concrete struggle. Your invitation to me and my brief reading about her expands my understanding of our situated yet common struggles. We have an opportunity and a responsibility now with our communication tools, with our ability to know about ourselves and one another, to harness our situated knowledges toward a true global movement that achieves Haraway's goal of intertwining the systemic realities with deep local constructivism. Part 2, my positionality. I'm a third-generation American. My great-grandparents were refugees. I'm sorry, not my great-grandparents. My grandparents were Jewish refugees from Russia, escaping the pogroms of 1919. Those were attacks on Jewish communities. And both my parents grew up in terribly poor families and were first generation in their families to attend university. My mother became a historian of the women's rights movement in the UK and the US, focusing on the history of women's rights. And as a child, I experienced her involvement in a class action lawsuit when she was not hired for a job as the only woman left behind in a merging of two universities. She sued the university, and I saw as a child that process of harnessing the legal system to try to achieve one's rights. However, she lost, and that was devastating for me as a child to see that struggle. Later on, she was able to collaborate for a number of decades with a Jamaican American historian named Winston Langley. And their collaboration together shaped her understanding of the tension between white and Black women suffragettes of the 19th century in the United States and the slave abolition movement. That understanding allowed me to come to an appreciation of the ways in which identity politics have been part of the struggle for freedom for centuries. For who was it that created those categories? The powerful, the elites, the colonizers, the academics, with access to resources to preserve power and create vast pools of cheap human labor, including academic labor, in service to power. Undoing this requires a radical revision of the academy, and feminists have a central role to play in this process. I began to learn about this process from my father, the first Jewish law professor at Boston College Law School, who advocated for removing crucifixes from classrooms in a Catholic university to create a more inclusive and international learning space where the symbol of one religion didn't preside over all others. My father was an international human rights lawyer who helped to craft the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and who always used female pronouns when offering general examples to destabilize the assumption of the universal he. As Malala, the well-known Malala, has brought to world attention, fathers who support daughters are key allies in the freedom struggles of girls and women. These and many more facets of my own family and personal experience have shaped my interests and perspectives, including my own interracial marriage, my Black and multiracial children, my ex-husband and now new partner, whose own family is from the Caribbean, and whose mother was a Black lesbian activist and scholar. I share all this with you because positionality is not only what shapes the researcher, but the researched. And positionality is a web of threads, woven and tangled and sometimes in tension, often shaping our deepest impulses, goals, and desires. Recognizing this as a foundational complexity is key to feminist research because it demands that we are self-reflexive in exploring how our own positionalities shape our assumptions, beliefs, and values, which enter into our research topics and processes, and how they affect those whom we work with. Part 3. Let me now turn to my own discipline of anthropology, weaving in that thread before outlining some very specific approaches to feminist research methodology. Anthropology began, as many of you may know, as a discipline that colluded in colonialism. The earliest Western anthropologists were part of the British, French, and American empires in the late 1880s. And while there has been a healthy tradition of dissenting voices since the early 20th century, the central thrust of the discipline was to reinforce colonial imperial hegemony through both the legitimating theories of racial and cultural hierarchies known as unilineal or cultural evolution, and later through reifying theories of functionalism and the reductive theory of structuralism. All were frameworks that sought explanation through totalizing and universalizing claims. Since the 1970s, anthropology has been engaged in both the process of decolonizing itself and challenging its own androcentrism, its male-centeredness, its Western-dominated theories and methodologies. I was trained in the 1980s in the midst of this process, and contributing to the dismantling of Western, white, and male-dominated perspectives of my discipline while mining the cracks of dissent, not forgetting the voices that pushed early on to remind us that counter-hegemony, critical thought, and recognition of multiple ways of knowing is not only the product of the present. The critiques that coalesced into women's studies as a multidisciplinary field have been undergirded by the two arms of feminism, scholarship and activism. both of which have permeated all disciplines. So even though I hail from anthropology, there have been common threads of feminism that have woven themselves into the multiple disciplines because women's studies is multidisciplinary. Feminist critiques, theories, methodologies, and the products of those processes, as previously mentioned, various forms of writing, from scholarly articles, essays, prose, poetry, and more recently, zines and blogs, to film and its contemporary offshoots, vlogs, video logs, as well as activist projects, have incorporated both arms of feminism, scholarship and activism. Change through the process of the creations of feminist research. For me, a central goal has been to help undo the mistrust that generations sowed before me as a decolonizing anthropologist. How is it possible to do this from a positionality in the West as a middle-class white Jewish woman academic with all this privilege? And how have others across their own privilege in their own societies worked to build trusting relationships with those whose lives become their livelihood through their research and scholar activism? For me, the solution, and the solution for many feminist anthropologists, has been partnership and collaboration with social movement actors, community leaders in their own societies. So building alliances with community leaders who are already underway in bringing about change in their own societies has been my pathway. I'd like to reflect a bit in this next part on partnership in an abbreviated story of what I have sought to chart as a pathway for moral collaboration, one that weaves the scholarly, the activist, and the personal, as I've outlined above. The work begins with a question: what does it mean to be a true partner? Prior to the 1980s, anthropologists generally referred to the people they researched as informants. This implies that knowledge is somewhat secretive and also moves in one direction from research subjects to the researcher. But in an effort to challenge a problematic history, to remake the discipline, many anthropologists, in particular feminist anthropologists from previously colonizing societies, have sought to transform their roles into collaborators and partners by placing community goals for liberation at the center of our work. The African scholar Nkiru Nzegwa has defined the concept of partnership in the following way, and I quote, "The term partner defines a relationship in which two or more groups of people who may occupy different sociocultural classes have chosen to work collaboratively in a communal effort to attain a common goal. Central to this idea and relationship is the presumption of equality. Even though their tasks and responsibilities may differ, partners choose to come together for either short or long-term objectives. Being partners, they cooperatively work toward that common goal. Participants in such ventures or alliances must have mutual respect for each other, even though they may not agree on everything." What does it mean in feminist research to have mutual respect? For the researcher, it means to first acknowledge the complexity of one's collaborators' own positionalities, their multiple roles and identities, and the legitimation of their own knowledges. This means that feminist research requires the situating of knowledge systems and the realities they produce. This process destabilizes the fixed self-other dichotomy of researcher-researched because it demands cooperation in common goals. However, such cooperation doesn't miraculously do away with material and power imbalances, but it does open doors for exploring ways in which some of these dichotomies are built on assumptions. For example, when I share with those I partner with that my current relative material well-being has not always been a constant, but that I once counted pennies, that I was poor, I lived in a trailer with my husband and 3 sons, relying on government support, even as a graduate student, because I married unconventionally, outside my socioeconomic class of origin, outside my religion, outside my ethnic, socially constructed racial group. I tell a story. I begin my research by making myself vulnerable, telling a story of my own life, sharing my pathway, and that becomes the opening for building collaborative relationships of trust. So that's the theoretical framework that I've laid out for you. And now if there's some time, I have an opportunity to share some of my own projects. Is there a little bit of time left before I take questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's see. Let me begin. There's a number of them. Let me begin. You referenced that I have produced some documentaries, and I can share the links with you as long as they're not posted on social media. If you were interested in seeing them. I began my training in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and then later in Trinidad and Tobago. And in Trinidad, I had a Fulbright fellowship where I taught at the University of the West Indies. And I was working on a research project called Gender, Women, and Water, trying to understand how men and women used and managed water differently, and what knowledge women brought to their management of water systems. Through that research project, I met a very powerful organizer, a woman named Akila Jaramogi, who herself began a non-governmental organization, who was known as one of the first women foresters, professional foresters in Trinidad. And she created this project called the Fonsamans Community Reforestation Project. I met her at a conference and she invited me to visit the project. The project transformed a community into an NGO and created green jobs for workers, from people from the community, to learn about regenerating a forest and sustaining a forest. I visited the community and I fell in love with it. And that started a 15-year collaboration that I'm still involved with, and a film that I produced. When I proposed to Akila that I wanted to create a film of the community, because this is a community that is situated about 15 minutes from 15 minutes walking from the capital of Port of Spain in Trinidad. And one walks into this community and suddenly you're outside the city in this beautiful forested hillside. And this hillside used to be deforested. It was degraded. There were forest fires burning. And it is situated in the foothills of a very important watershed and mountain range that protects the water and the forests for the rest of the island. So I approached Akila asking her if she would want a film made about her community. And even though I had known her for a number of years, researching the community and working with her on trying to gain funds for the NGO and the like, when I suggested a film, the first thing she said to me is, how do I know that you're not just going to take this footage and run off with it and build your career on my film, on my community? How can I trust you? And then I realized that after working with her for 3 or 4 years already, the relationship of trust was not yet fully cemented. So I promised her that this film would be made with her goals in mind and the community goals in mind. What story did she and the community want to tell that they could then share with others about turning a community into a non-governmental organization, having women as the leaders of a community, forging careers in forestry, which is not a women-dominated field, and bringing about a transformation to the environment through cultural knowledge systems of managing the forest. What story did she want to tell? So we got the community together, we conducted interviews, I had a team, And that led to the creation of the film, which is now used as part of their advocacy work. It has twin goals. It's a reflection of the partnership. I use it in my teaching. I use it to help raise funds as a member of the board of her organization for the community. And she uses it, as do others in the community, as a model to teach what the community has achieved so that others can start to do the same. The second film that I worked on with the same film team, a camera woman and an editor, it's an all-women film team. And I believe you saw this, Madhurami, in Bangkok. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I'm not sure. This is a film about the LGBT movement in Jamaica. And here, the collaboration and partnership was with an LGBT human rights organization. I had conducted fieldwork in Jamaica since my graduate years. When I was 23, I started. That's over 30 years ago. And one of the things that I learned in the process was that gender roles were very divisive. There were a lot of tensions between men and women. And also, there was a significant amount of violence against LGBT people. And I got to a point where I did not want to continue research in that society without somehow contributing to building awareness about the LGBT movement. So that's when I decided to reach out to this organization called JFLAG, the Jamaican Forum for All Lesbians, Sexuals, and Gays, and proposed to them to make a short film in the similar fashion that the previous film had been made, a film that could be used in their own advocacy work to build awareness about LGBT rights in Jamaica, and also one that I could use in my teaching and in my own work. So again, it was the twin goals. How can a project be both useful for researcher and researched as a collaborative endeavor? And interestingly, when I met with the director of the organization, he said the same thing to me that Akila had said to me. How can I trust you? How do I know that you're going to take this knowledge that is our personal knowledge, that puts our lives at stake when we share with you, because we're making ourselves public and visible to a homo and transphobic society? How can I trust you? Well, I shared with him the work that I had done. I proved myself. And what I have found is that with each project, that process of having to prove oneself, of sharing one's background, of making oneself vulnerable, of identifying one's positionality, that is a moral requirement that feminist researchers and feminist ethnographers have to undertake. There's no way that the people in the organization in Jamaica would have any understanding of who I was or what my commitments were. So it is incumbent upon me each time to renew this partnership and to establish the foundations of my own value system. So having undergone that process and sharing a bit about myself, I then came to Jamaica with the film crew to film the second Pride celebration that Jamaica has ever held, and to tell stories, not just stories of suffering, not just stories of victimization. The organization asked that the film tell stories of resilience. The film is called Many Loves, One Heart, Stories of Courage and Resilience, to show that Jamaicans are finding ways to make a life. LGBTQ Jamaicans are finding ways to build a life and to live and to an achievement in spite of the climate in which they live. And many Jamaicans seek asylum. At least they did before the Trump administration. He has ruined that, unfortunately. Hopefully that will change. But many Jamaicans, many LGBTQ Caribbean people have sought asylum in the United States to live freely their sexual diversity. And J-Flag wanted an alternative story told, not a story about people leaving Jamaica, but a story of people staying in Jamaica and fighting. So the first film is a collaboration with a women's, environmental, Black power, social movements that are intersectional. The second is a collaboration with an LGBT movement and an human rights movement. And I, as the feminist anthropologist, found a way to enter into those movements by starting with my own positionality and then developing an idea of what the collaboration should look like, and then being true to that collaboration over a period of time. Those are two examples. I can tell more, I can open questions. How would you like to proceed?
Yes. So participants, would you like to, do you have questions you would like to ask at this hour, Professor Fox?
I'd love to know about.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes. Yes, hello.
Yes.
Yeah, myself Purabi. Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, go on.
Yeah, ma'am, as you say, positionality is a very much relevant topic in terms as far as the feminist research is concerned. Ma'am, would you please give some insights about the about on that? Like as a researcher, most of the time, as a female researcher, entry into the field, the lived experiences of the female researcher has been different, and the lived experiences of the male researchers also be different. So, as a female researcher, when we enter into the field, we have to face certain challenges. Like trust is one of the important that you have just now mentioned, that community trust and the researcher, the goal, community goal and the researcher goal, like that. So ma'am, that epistemological of the epistemological meaning of such context, the positionality, if you give your a little bit insights, it would be very helpful for us.
Yes, yes, absolutely. There are many. I've just shared a very little bit about positionality, but there are many ways that it has an impact. Historically, I'll start historically in anthropology and then share a little bit from there. Who we are shapes who we have access to in a community. So given that the majority of anthropologists in the early years were from colonial societies of Great Britain and France and the United States, traveling to former colonies. Those men predominantly had access to other men. And while some of them were able to interview women, very few interviewed women. They spoke to men about the men's perspective of their own societies. They gathered data from predominantly more powerful men, but not exclusively. And what they learned about women was from the perspective of men. I always ask my students, particularly my women students, if somebody asked their brothers or their fathers or their uncles to describe their lives to them, would they give a description that accurately reflects their own identities, their own values and goals and thoughts? Maybe a little bit, or maybe not. But the epistemology of identity is critical, not only in terms of whom we have access to, but the kind of questions that we ask. So our own life experiences, our own exposure to various theories, all these things come together in shaping the question, the research question. What are we interested in? What do we want to know and why? And therefore, the knowledge that we create is a reflection of that. When I first went to Jamaica, I was, as I said, 23. I was a single woman. I was a graduate student. And over the years, I was able to explore how my own changing positionality affected my access to knowledge. Later, I returned with my baby daughter, and that affected my access to knowledge, because the community wanted to regulate when I would go out in the day, with whom I would talk. But it also gave me access to talking to other mothers of young children in ways that I didn't previously have access to, because they identified with me. And throughout my life, as my daughter has traveled with me quite a bit, I've taken her along with me. And so that has positioned me as a mother as well as a professor. And then over time, I built kin relationships with my research communities. So the kin relationships established responsibilities, obligations. It would shape what I had to do for the family, and therefore limited and shaped my my fieldwork experience. So over the course of my life, and now my children are adults, and I'm a more established, and so that too affects how people perceive me. So when we go into communities, again, knowledge is not unidirectional. We are perceived by others, and how we fit into the social structure, the cultural belief systems and values of the society that we're collaborating with is very critical in terms of shaping our access, the questions, and the outcomes of our research. I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you, Purvi. Are you satisfied? Hello?
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So we can
Let me say one more thing. Let me say one more thing about this. Women's lives are shaped not only by our experiences, just as men's lives are not. We are biocultural beings. Anthropology identifies that we are biocultural beings. That means that our bodies have realities. And the realities of our bodies intersect with the values of the society. So for younger women who are undergoing menstruation, for example, what is the experience of being a researcher who is going through her own bodily transformations? What access to sanitation exists in the communities? How does that access also affect her understanding of the lives of people who are positioned similarly? How does the university help sustain the researcher in the access to resources that the researcher needs? Can I write in my grant application that I need sanitary pads? Not likely. So there are still, the ways in which we are positioned as researchers. How can we travel? Is it safe to travel? Can we conduct research at night in certain neighborhoods? What ability do we have to walk as individuals through certain parts of communities? I had the experience once of being mugged, being attacked in Jamaica early on. I didn't know that I was walking in a place that I shouldn't be walking by myself, and also I stood out with my white skin, and I was younger, and so I was victimized, and that was traumatic for me at the time. But I was told just to continue with my research. So there are also logistical, operational dimensions of our positionality that shape the research process, in addition to the that are tied to the epistemological knowledge construction processes as well.
Thank you, Professor Fox. Any other question? Can we go to the next question? Professor Fox, we have these research scholars who are midway of their research. Either they have finished or they have just started. And I think this is a very good talk. Maybe it's an informal kind of a talk, but then you have a lot of insights that you can derive from this talk. I request the researchers to kindly put questions to Professor Fox.
I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes. Hello.
Is there any in the chat? I think are there any questions? I'm looking.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Good evening, ma'am. I am Niaz from Nagaon.
Good evening, good morning, my time.
Okay, let's say good morning in your place. So I have a question. It's a very normal question in the academic field. To see, you see, even if you're in the 21st century, when it comes to the academic field, the when they say about the anthropological research methodologies and anthropological methodologies, the thing feminist methodology isn't seen in the line of normalcy, and the answers they give when I question them, they say is there is an absence of heteronormity in feminist research. So what do you have to say about it?
An absence of heteronormativity?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. I think there's a presence of heteronormativity. I think that heteronormativity you're saying that LGBT realities dominate? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't agree with you. Actually, I think that that's taken a while to emerge. That while feminist thought has laid the foundation, I think, for queer and theory, and which has emerged out of it, gender theory has emerged out of feminism. Early feminist researchers were in heterosexual relationships. Many of them actually, in anthropology, we have husband and wife teams, which is very common. And women, feminist researchers, were in the field with their husbands. And that's an interesting epistemological reflection as well, since women often ended up doing research either as assistants to their husbands or in certain gendered aspects of the work that their husbands were not working on. Over time, the LGBT perspectives have shaped feminist anthropology. So, for example, in the United States, among Native American groups, there is a third and fourth genders called two-spirits, which are similar in some ways to the positionality of hijras in India. They are not man, not woman, and they occupy particular spiritual and gender roles. And awareness of hijras happened really early for American anthropologists in the late 1800s, in fact. But their realities, their worldviews were marginalized due to the impact of Christian thinking that was dominant at the time. So it's been a slow process in feminist anthropology, at least in the Western world, of collaboration between queer theorists and gender diverse theorists. It is happening now, and I was able to draw from it in my own work in Jamaica. But these are fields, within the academy as well, if you look at syllabi, feminist anthropological syllabi about writing or doing ethnography, you do not find LGBTQ perspectives central. They're still unfortunately marginalized, although again, that is changing. It is incumbent upon us, I think, as feminist researchers, and when I say feminist researchers, I'm including all genders who claim feminism. I mean, that's one of the reasons I mentioned my father earlier on. He was a feminist. He had no difficulty calling himself a feminist. My current partner, a man, is a feminist. And it's very important for men to be able to claim that. But it's incumbent for us as feminist researchers to acknowledge the reality, going back to Donna Haraway, the reality of multiple genders and multiple sexualities, and for that to trouble and make difficult and challenging our assumptions of any kind of binary.
Yes.
Sure, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. We can go to the next question.
Yes, ma'am. May I ask my question?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Just tell your name.
Gaurav Singh from Kolkata.
Hello.
Yes, good morning, ma'am. The session was quite inspiring, and it was really a pleasure listening to you. I
Thank you.
just I have two questions. I did my MPhil in women's studies, and
Mm-hmm.
though my parent discipline is English literature, and I also have the NET National Eligibility Test qualification in women's studies, but
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, the present situation in women's studies in India is, it's on the brink of marginalization, and the centers are shutting down and everything. So, as a researcher, feminist researcher, and everything, I had to go back to literature, and now I'm planning to pursue a PhD in literature on lines of feminism. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm also presently working as an English faculty in one of the colleges in Kolkata. So this is a really unfortunate situation. So I would like you to comment on this situation. How do we cope up with this, the erasure, marginalization of gender studies, women's studies, and especially in the Indian context, but I know it's applicable overall in the global context as well. And
Mm-hmm.
apart from that, the second question is, since you were talking about positionality based on research, feminist research methodology. So again, in the Indian context, it becomes somewhat difficult to mention one's queer position in their own research work. So how do we cope up with this? Because there is widespread queer phobia, homophobia regarding queer folks, LGBTQI. So how do we cope up with this? And just a request, please kindly share the links of your documentaries because we would love to watch them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are some very important and interesting questions. And I think that your approach to pursuing a feminist angle through literature is an important approach. What it does, and this is an interesting tension. I'll just backstep a little bit. The creation of women's studies and women and gender studies, and now women, gender, and sexuality studies programs is both an important achievement, but also in some ways potentially a step in a longer term process, depending on your vision of things, about the mainstreaming and integrating of these perspectives across the academy. In some ways, you might look at this as an opportunity. You might turn this marginalization into an opportunity to infiltrate the various disciplines and programs with feminist and queer research as a way of pushing back. If monies are not being allocated to the creation of specific departments, to the granting of PhDs, for research, for the hiring of faculty in those positions, the approach, as with all activism, has to be multi-pronged. I would not simply just accept the condition, because I don't believe that we're in a state where we can say that these perspectives, the theories, and the methodologies have permeated other disciplines to such an extent that these departments are no longer necessary. They are still necessary. They still raise important perspectives. So at the same time that they are diminishing, there has to be pushback. There has to be advocacy. Now, I know under the current Modi regime, as similarly to the Trump regime, when you have an authoritarian, dictatorial, patriarchal, fascist, neo-fascist government that is sort of waging war on the diversity of its people, it is a very difficult environment to advocate for the need for these programs and to reinfuse them with funding. But one way to do it is to recognize, I think, the importance of transnationalism and that we're having a transnational conversation now. Make use of whatever kinds of granting opportunities exist, whether it's a Fulbright, an overseas Fulbright, whether it's seeking funding for in a collaborative way with an organization overseas to infuse funding into your local university. And at the same, that's one strategy. Another strategy is to keep pushing at the local level. Find allies in local government who can be responsive. Draw on historical examples and achievements to demonstrate how integrating women and queer and gender diverse ideas, and not only ideas but realities in an equitable way into society uplifts the entire society. There's so many examples out there of how, for example, just by way of an example, women in the process of women in development, which led to gender in development, has demonstrated that when women are contributing productive labor, then the whole household is uplifted. The well-being of children, the nutritional needs of children are improved upon. And so drawing on the research that's been done by way of levying an argument and tapping into those in local government who can support, whether it's local organizations or branches within the university, while simultaneously seeking funds overseas, and third, bringing those perspectives into the departments that already exist, as a three-pronged approach to a three-pronged response to the problem that's occurring. I know in the United States there's been testimony and testifying before local governments in order to advocate for funding for these programs. And the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which is demonstrating the vulnerabilities of society and the impact of those vulnerabilities on the whole, is really underscoring how inequalities have to be addressed in order to uplift everybody. Appealing to people in power by saying that they are going to suffer if they don't pay attention to others is one strategy to do that. So I hope that answers your first question a little bit. The second question is also a challenge. I mean, all of this, all kinds of activism for social change requires some risk. And people have to determine on their own what kind of risk they're willing to take. Those who have laid the foundations for us today took significant risks. People have gone on hunger strikes. They've chained themselves to buildings. They've put their bodies at risk. That is not something that I would ask anybody to do. We all have to determine our own level of risk. One has to think through, what risk is one taking if one identifies oneself as queer in positionality in one's own writing? What are the possible outcomes? Is it also possible to build over time a community of collegial support for this openness, citing all those who have come before you, so that you are positioning yourself in relationship to a community of scholars? Because there was just a huge conference, a web conference in India about the LGBT rights movement. I wasn't able to participate too much in it because of the time differences, but they're building alliances across universities, finding out who's doing what, connecting the university with the advocacy groups, with the human rights movements, so that you have a support base if you choose to, or you or anybody, not assuming anybody's identity, but anybody who chooses to come forward and position their sexuality. There are ways to cushion the risk if you spend some time building up your community of support and locating yourself within that community. That's what I would suggest.
Okay.
Thank you
Gaurav,
so
is it
much.
all right? Okay,
Yes,
okay. So
thank you
thank
so
you,
much for
Gaurav, for
your
your
thoughts,
question.
and
Again, we
thank
can
you,
go to
ma'am.
the next question. It's already past
Ma'am,
8:30.
ma'am, I
Yeah.
have one question.
Okay, okay. Just tell your name.
Uh, Good evening, ma'am. My
Yes.
name is Ankit Shah, and I am pursuing MA in English at Tezpur Central University. So,
Okay.
as we often see, the birth of a son always is to be feasted upon, and it is a common belief that a daughter always spells misery. She is to be married off with a dowry, and she is to be educated to qualify as a desirable bride. So, how we can deconstruct these ideas? How to destroy the idea of the other that women are always associated with? We find that women are always considered to be negative. How to deconstruct these patriarchal motives, and uh, this is my question: how to destroy this concept of other?
Is the
That's a
most
huge
difficult question
question.
that you have put, Ankit.
How do I change the world?
Yes.
Well, well, I, this is again, positionality comes into play here. One has to think about one's spheres of influence, and you can start very locally. I mean, again, I think social change takes place from multiple angles at multiple levels over time. For you yourself, how are you positioned within your family, within your community, with your friends, in any kind of religious organization? How can you start to explain and take a stand and behave differently? That's the beginning. When we hear people, for example, in the United States right now, we're having huge conversations about race, as you may be aware of, with our social protests and the Black Lives Matters movement. And I know that in India and also in Nepal, this has spilled over into a Dalit Lives Matter movement, which is fantastic. But when you're in a situation where people are saying things that are not true, whether they're making jokes about people, whether they are at their expense, whether they are citing examples of people's behavior that they think reflects a whole group of people. There are always ways to intervene. So at the very lowest level of our own interpersonal lives, we start by taking these steps. And it takes courage to do so, to not just listen and reinforce the dominant ideologies, but to struggle against them personally. Again, we have to think, what is the risk of doing that? Do we always do it? Do we do it at certain times? And then again, within our community groups, India is such an active country. There are so many organizations, so many Southern-based NGOs, etc. How do you build alliances? Building alliances is key, right? So building alliances with your friend group, working with the NGOs in your community, with local community-based organizations, with teachers. Education is central, starting with the education of boys as well. Socialization of boys, and including boys in housework, children's stories, educational texts, examining the gender-based assumptions and the value systems of gender that permeate educational systems, and unpacking them, dismantling them, changing the relations and labor of work in your household. All of these are not easy to do, but they have to start. Because as these boys grow up, and as girls who have internalized their own oppression and their own limited roles grow, they have to be challenged from a very early age. Having discussions in the household and reflections, all of those are processes. And then, of course, from at the upper level, at the level of the law, to holding the law accountable. There have been significant legal developments in India that have given opportunities for protections, but they're not being necessarily enforced. That's the case in many places. How do you raise funds, for example, so that a woman who is beaten in an act of domestic violence is protected by the laws that exist to protect her, rather than people assuming that that is the right of the husband or father to engage in that behavior, and the police not supporting it, the police not using the law to protect women, but to keeping that as the domain of the personal, the domestic sphere. So education across has to happen at multiple levels, starting with one's own household, and also one has to take a stand and start to transform conversations locally and advocate for implementation of existing laws.
Ankit?
That's what
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay. We can go to Pooja Borgohain. You have a question, and we can have many more questions. We have to have a different, on a separate day, we will have one more question hour. We can have Pooja's question. Pooja Borgohain, you can have your question. Yes.
I think that.
Pooja is not there.
Your mic is on mute. Pooja, your mic is on mute.
Pooja, are you there? We can go to the next question. We can have two more questions, and then we come to the end of the session, and then we can have, another session some other day. So which will be a question hour for, as I can see that there is a whole lot of, enthusiasm among the researchers, and they want to talk to Professor Fox, and they want to solve their problems. This is very good. You could see your.
Hello.
Yes, Pooja, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry,
Yes,
I was disconnected.
Oh, okay. You can have it.
Yes, it's an honor to be a part of this program.
Yes.
And my question is, if you look back to the history and culture of India, in the Vedic period, the women were treated like they were equal to men. And even we see in the Chandragupta Maurya's period, they were in the army as well. But later on, it turned to be opposite, and women were not treated as they were treated in that period. And we can also see that our parents these days, means in present, they are much more concerned about the dowry they have to give to the what
I know
they
what
call. Hello.
Yes.
They are most the parents are more concerned about the dowry than about their child's education and the price. So what's your opinion about this?
That sounds like the question that I just answered. I think that parents who are supporting a marriage of their daughters before their education are operating under a set of assumptions. And I think that probably on some level, it's not just that they want to limit the lives of their daughters, but they're concerned about their daughters' futures. And so I think that when people support what we might consider regressive or conservative or archaic ways of thinking and doing, it's not necessarily out of malevolence. It's out of a limited understanding and maybe even an actual, a real concern about opportunities and futures. So I think that part of the process of change involves reassurance of the pathways forward through alternative strategies. And it also requires, as somebody earlier pointed out, a recognition that women have, girls and women have intellectual capacities and desires and goals as boys and men do. And that is a process that, again, often takes some risk and challenge for change. This kind of change doesn't come easily. I'm thinking, I spent my sabbatical last year in Nepal studying a women's art movement. And women artists are using their art to raise awareness and consciousness about child marriage, about the caste system, and the like. And in Nepal, historically, women were not artists. It was a particular caste of men, for example, and art was considered decorative, or stories from mythology, which actually reinforced some of the very conservative views of women. So when women started to become artists and use art for social and political purposes, they started to communicate new messages that started to permeate society and open conversations. And that's one of the ways in which some of the changes have occurred. One of the artists that I interviewed, she is married to a man who is also an artist, and it's an out-of-caste marriage. And this is very unusual. It took years for her parents to come around and accept the marriage. She was excluded she and her husband were excluded from their community. But it was, for them, they took that risk. So building awareness through, not just through the academy, through art, through drama, exposing people to new ideas, and taking the risk of being the change that you want to see in the world, living the change that you want to see in the world, however you can do that, is a beginning in that process. And once again, educate yourself about the groups that are out there that are advocating for these changes already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people out there already trying to work against this, and align yourself. See what kind of roles you can take to help move the process along.
And ma'am, hello?
Yes,
Hello.
yes.
Yes. And ma'am, what about to do about the remote areas? Like in those areas, we have heard about rumors, some like Daini Hatya, like it's
Witch
in
hunting,
English,
witch hunting.
yeah, it's English, it's called like witch hunting. And they used
Yeah.
to do this kind of things. And in present period also, these things are happening in our areas, and mostly in the remote areas too. What our steps would be to do to stop
Yeah.
those things?
Witchcraft accusations are on the rise globally in many places, and they're often a symptom of deep inequality. They're often a way of reinforcing the status quo, and punishing people who step outside that status quo. I think that, again, organizational advocacy is really one of the only pathways forward. Organizations that go into communities and talk with people and have community meetings, and hear about people's concerns and suggest alternative ways of dealing with them. If people don't have alternatives or other explanations for their problems, then they resort to the same set of solutions and the same practices. So these are huge problems that you're asking about, and I appreciate that you're asking me. I mean, I obviously don't have solutions to all the problems, but I believe very strongly in multiple level action, in individuals taking change in their own lives, and in socialization change of boys, of men being outspoken in support of those, and of collaboration across different sectors of society.
Pooja, it's all right? Yes, yes.
Yes,
I think,
ma'am, thank
Professor Fox,
you.
you can see the range of questions that we have right now, and it's not possible for us to run the session longer because, it's going to be 9 here. I think we need to, if Professor Fox, she agrees, we will have yet another session sometime later where these research scholars can come and they can pose their questions and you will get your answers. But I would like the assurance from Professor Fox that she will readily agree to come for yet another session and be with us, because I understand my participants that this is too ambitious, isn't it? But that you learn that what kind of projects are being, done outside. And the way things have been done, it's not only, doing gender studies and women's studies inside a classroom. What Professor Fox has been talking about is a totally different world, including positionality. And see the way she has developed. She's not a feminist. She's not a born feminist. You know how from a normal human being, how she has turned into so not only a feminist, not only an anthropologist. This is something very important. And this is the new knowledge. I think what is important right now, my dear participants, is that we have this new knowledge, maybe produced from the feminist methodologies, that will be a link to the advocacy, to activism, to human rights, and what is most important is social justice. It's there. So I think I'm very sorry that we have to end this session. Professor Fox, I don't know how I'm going to say, and to offer my gratitude, and from my participants also, we are very thankful that you confirmed and that you're here, and it was so interesting listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak with all of you. I'd be happy at some point to have just a Q&A session.
Yes.
We can go from there.
We will plan it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Have a good night, everybody. Good night. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Let's see. Do I turn this